Welcome to our Sunday School Bible Study time here at Southwest Park Baptist Church. This is our lesson for August the 1st. We are continuing our study in Ecclesiastes, which we started last week. Our lesson this week is entitled, What Time Is It? God, the wise person stewards time, realizing that God controls all things. Our focal passage is the 3rd chapter of Ecclesiastes, the first 15 verses, and then the larger text includes the rest of chapter 3 and the first 6 verses in chapter 4. Our lesson writer points out that time is one of the most valuable commodities that we have, and our scripture today, verses 1 through 15 in chapter 3, is a poem that speaks with eloquence of the role of time in the life of the believer. Some people look at Ecclesiastes as describing a life apart from God, but as we look at this passage today, clearly this part of the text describes a life that's lived in relationship with God. And so through these words, Solomon's teaching us that not that everything has an opportune time according to which we should choose an action there, but rather that all events are in the hand of God, who makes everything happen in the time that He judges to be appropriate. And so we're going to look first of all at the first 8 verses where Solomon in verses 2 through 8, he gives us 14 pairs of opposites that describes time. So let's look at verses 1 through 8. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to gain and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. So 14 pairs there, opposites, really, that relate to time. And he starts out in verse 1 by saying, to everything there's a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. And last week we talked about that, the phrase under the sun, as meaning our time here on earth, that life that's lived on the earth. Under heaven carries much the same meaning, the sphere in which human life is lived. And when he says to everything there's a season and a time for every purpose, both season and time refer to specific points in time rather than a continuity of time. There's a specific point in time there where to everything there's a season and there's a time for every purpose. Now, you don't have to be a philosopher or a scientist to know that times and seasons are a part of life, no matter where you live. So not only are there times and seasons in this world, but there's also an overruling providence in our lives. There is a sovereign God in our lives. From before our birth to the moment of our death, God is accomplishing His divine purpose, even though Many times we're not aware, we're not understanding what he's doing. So in these 14 statements, Solomon affirmed that God's at work in our individual lives and seeking to accomplish his will. So let's take a look at them. In verse 2, he starts with a time to be born and a time to die. Those are natural events in human life, and the birth and the death form the boundaries of life under the sun, life in this world. And so it's natural that they would be mentioned first. Now, when you think about birth and death, there are issues surrounding them in our world, and technology has brought some of those to us. So things like abortion and birth control, mercy killing, surrogate parenthood, they make it look like sometimes that man's in control of birth and death. But Solomon here says birth and death are not human accidents. They're divine appointments where God is in control. And we can foolishly hasten our death, but we can't prevent it when our time comes unless God wills it. Psalm 139:16 says, "All the days ordained for me were written in your book." So there's a time to be born and a time to die. The second part of verse 2 says there's a time for planting and a time to pluck what is planted. The Jews were an agricultural people, so they would have appreciated the seasons, and this part of Solomon's lecture here. Their religious calendar was based on the agricultural year. And so we know that man can plow and sow, but only God gives the increase. There's a time to plant. The plucking can refer to either the reaping, and which we understand when you plant, the crop grows, and then there's a time to reap what's been sown. It could also refer to pulling up unproductive plants, because sometimes when the crop is gathered, then it's necessary to pluck up those plants that have served their purpose to prepare for the next cycle. A successful farmer knows that nature works for him only if he works with nature. And that's a good formula for a successful life. Learn God's principles and cooperate with them. In verse 3, he says there's a time to kill and a time to heal. In the plan of God, there is a time to kill. There's the plan of God provides for executing murderers. Genesis 9:6. If anyone takes a human life, that person's life will also be taken by human hands. For God made human beings in his own image. There's a time for going to war against enemies there. And so there's a time to kill. That's not a very pleasant thought there. But there's also a time to heal, a time to make those overtures and provide healing in relationships. There's a time to break down and a time to build up. There's a time for dismantling what we've built. It wears out. There's also a time even for dismantling nations. In Isaiah 5:5, now let me tell you what I will do to my vineyard, the Lord says. I will tear down its hedges and let it be destroyed. I will break down its walls and let the animals trample it. There's a beautiful passage in Jeremiah 18 where the Lord told Jeremiah to go down to the potter's house. I've got something there I want to show you. So he did as God told him, and he found the potter working at his wheel. But the vessel that he was making didn't turn out as he had hoped, so he crushed it into a lump of clay again and started over. The Lord gave me this message: O Israel, can I not do to you as this potter has done to his clay? As the clay is in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand. So spiritually and metaphorically, sometimes God has to tear down some of our pride and rebellion and all those things in order to build us up into what he wants us to be. In verse 4, he says there's a time to weep and a time to laugh. God's plan includes both sorrow and joy. Believers don't mourn in the same way as unbelievers, but we do mourn. Matthew 5:4 says, God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. There's a time to mourn and a time to dance, and dancing and leaping are natural ways of expressing pleasure and laughter and joy as we experience those things that produce those kind of emotions. Verse 5 says there's a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones. A couple of ways to interpret that. In times of peace, stones were cleared from fields, allowing for cultivation. But in wartime, the rocks were thrown into the field to make them unusable. So in that sense, it speaks specifically about the physical stones. The second part of that verse says a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. And a lot of Bible scholars see that as referring to the sexual embrace, and in fact some see that whole verse 5, both of those images there, as referring to the sexual relationship. There are times for expressing and times for refraining from love, and that's a relevant reminder for all of us today that there are standards for sex and within our relationships. Verse 6 says a time to gain and a time to lose. Warren Wiersbe says that another translation of that first part of verse 6 is a time to search and a time to give it up for lost. Now, I'm getting to the age where when I give it up for lost is when I usually find it. I was working outside just a few days ago, and I needed a clamp, and I knew I had that clamp, and I knew it was right there. And I looked and I looked and I looked for it until I gave up and went ahead and made do with something else. And then I turned around and looked, and it was hanging there 2 feet from where I was working. So that's the way it worked for me. But there's a time to search and a time to give it up for lost. A time to keep and a time to throw away. Again, Brother Wiersbe says that phrase gives biblical authority for garage sales. And I guess that's a good way to look at it. There's a time to keep and a time to clean house. There's a period of life in which we accumulate things for enjoyment and memories. And some of us do more of that than others. Later in life, one needs to work out ways to dispose of what's been accumulated. And that's not always easy to do, I'm finding out there. Verse 7 says there's a time to tear and a time to sow. In that culture, in that day, when bad news came, it was customary to rip one's garments, to tear one's garments, to show grief. But when the grief had passed, when the mourning period was ended, it was time then to sew the garment back together. There's a time to keep silence and a time to speak. And we see the reality of that all the time. Most of us speak when we shouldn't, a lot more than we keep silent when we shouldn't. A time to love and a time to hate. Are God's people allowed to hate? The fact that the next phrase mentioned war and peace suggests that Solomon may have had the nation in mind here. But there are some things that even Christians ought to hate, the Bible tells us. Psalm 97:10 says, "You who love the Lord hate evil." Proverbs 6:16-19 is a very familiar passage. There are 6 things the Lord hates. No, 7 things he detests. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that kill the innocent, a heart that plots evil, feet that race to do wrong, a false witness who pours out lies, a person who sows discord in a family. So what does it all mean, these 14 things? In these 14 statements, Solomon affirmed that God is at work in our individual lives, seeking to accomplish His will. But how do we fit? How do we navigate that tension between God's sovereignty in our lives and our free will, our ability to make choices and to do things? A.W. Tozer was a well-known evangelical pastor of the first half of the 20th century. He had this to say. He said, "Man's will is free because God is sovereign." Perhaps a homely illustration might help us to understand. An ocean liner leaves New York bound for Liverpool. Its destination has been determined by proper authorities. Nothing can change it. This is at least a faint picture of sovereignty. On board the liner are several scores of passengers. They're not in chains, neither are their activities determined for them by decree. They're completely free to move about as they will. They eat, sleep, play, lounge about on the deck, read, talk together as they please, but all the while the great liner is carrying them steadily toward a predetermined port. Both freedom and sovereignty are present here, and they do not contradict each other. So it is, I believe, with man's freedom and the sovereignty of God. The mighty liner of God's sovereign design keeps its steady course over the sea of history. God moves undisturbed and unhindered toward the fulfillment of those eternal purposes which He purposed in Jesus Christ before the world began. We don't know all that's included in those purposes, but enough has been disclosed to furnish us with a broad outline of things to come and to give us good hope and firm assurance of well-being. Let's look at verses 9 through 13. What profit has the worker from that in which he labors? I have seen the God-given task with which the sons of men are to be occupied. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, He has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. So the preacher here adjusted his sights, and he no longer just looked at life under the sun. He brings God into the picture here, and it gives him a new perspective. In verse 9 here, he repeated the opening question of verse 3 in chapter 1. Is all this labor really worth it? What profit has the worker from that in which he labors, he asks. And in the light of this new perspective, Solomon gave 3 answers to those questions that we'll see here. First of all, Solomon says man's life is a gift from God. Verse 10, I have seen the God-given task with which the sons of men are to be occupied. Now, the work that we do, the labor and the travail of it may make it seem to us that life is a strange gift, but it is God's gift to us just the same. If we accept life as a gift and thank God for it, we'll have a better attitude toward the burdens that come our way. If we grudgingly accept life as a burden, then we'll miss the gifts that come our way. Outlook helps to determine outcome, Warren Wiersbe says. And we're going to talk a little bit more about attitude right at the end of this part of this passage. One of the words that's unique to the book of Ecclesiastes is task. And here it kind of has a neutral connotation. Sometimes when we see it, it has a negative connotation as something burdensome. But here it's just descriptive. I have seen the God-given task. And the God-given is important there because it emphasizes that life and the tasks that we perform in this life are given to us by God. Verse 11 is a familiar verse, and it's a beautiful verse. He has made everything beautiful in its time. All of God's creation is beautiful. The original creation was certainly that way. If you remember in Genesis, as God made all of the things that he created, he looked at them and he said, they're good. Man, Adam and Eve's sin in the garden, changed all of that to a certain degree. But still, God made everything beautiful in its time. From the divine perspective, there's no ugliness in the events of our lives. So the second thing that we see in these verses here, the second perspective, is in verse 11, man's life is linked to eternity. God has put eternity in their hearts, Solomon says. Man was created in the image of God. We know that. And he was given dominion over creation. Therefore, he's different from the rest of creation. And that phrase, eternity in their hearts, refers to a deep-seated, compulsive drive to transcend our morality by knowing the meaning and destiny of the world. Because we're made in the image of God, we have an innate, an inborn inquisitiveness about eternal realities. So we can find peace only when we come to know our eternal Creator. And we see the affirmation of that all the time. People seek satisfaction and peace in all different kinds of activities and endeavors. It's only when they come to the Lord that they find that true peace that they're seeking. A.W. Tozer again. The only reason that men and women can be saved is the fact that God has put eternity in our hearts. Man is fallen, yes. Man is lost, a sinner, and needs to be born again, yes. But God made man in his own image, and he keeps the longing after eternity and a desire after everlasting life within the hearts of men. The last part of verse 11 says, except no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. So even then, Even though God's put eternity in our hearts and we can find peace in our relationship with Him, we know God only in part. All we see is the micro moment of our own existence in the grand span of eternity. So, the Scripture calls on us to live in faith during times of trial and pain. In the grand scheme of things, God will make everything beautiful. God accomplishes His purposes in His time, but it will not be until we enter eternity that we will begin to comprehend His total plan. In verse 12 and 13, He tells us that man's life can be enjoyable now. I know that nothing's better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives. So the advice of Solomon here is to seize the day in the joy of the Lord. Biblical faith is a call for joy, even when we live in a wicked world and under terrible stress. That's because we find true joy in the living God. Every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. The enjoyment of life is an important theme in Ecclesiastes, and we saw a little bit of that last week in chapter 2, verse 24. And it's mentioned in several times in chapters 3 through 10. As Warren Wiersbe points out, Solomon is encouraging not pagan hedonism, but rather the practice of enjoying God's gift as the fruit of one's labor, no matter how difficult life may be. Life appears to be transitory, but whatever God does is forever. So when we live for Him and let Him have His way, life is meaningful and life is manageable. Instead of complaining about what we don't have, let's enjoy what we do have and thank God for it. Now we have to note here, Solomon is not saying, don't worry, be happy. He's not promoting, he's promoting faith in God, not faith in faith or pie in the sky by and by. Faith is only as good as the object of faith. And the greatest object of faith is the Lord. He can be trusted. How can life be meaningless and monotonous for you when God has made you a part of His eternal plan? You are not an insignificant insect crawling from one sad annihilation to another. If you have trusted Jesus Christ, you're a child of God being prepared for an eternal home. The Puritan pastor Thomas Watson said, "Eternity to the godly is a day that has no sunset. Eternity to the wicked is a night that has no sunrise." I was sitting in the doctor's office yesterday waiting on the doctor, and I was looking around, and there was a plaque on the wall, and I read it, and I thought, that kind of goes along with our Sunday school lesson this week. So I took a picture of it, and I'm going to read it to you here. Now I know if you watch TV, if you watch the progressive commercials, Dr. Rick is always given these lessons on how to avoid becoming your parents. And he's death on these plaques and things. But it's too late for me because I like them. And so I took a picture of that one. In case no one told you today, you are beautiful. You are loved. You are needed. You are alive for a reason. You are stronger than you think. You're going to get through this. Don't give up. So I think that's what Solomon says here in these verses. You are alive for a reason. So don't give up. When I read that, I thought about a plaque that I had on my wall when I was working, and it was from Charles Swindoll, a quote from Charles Swindoll. It's entitled Attitude. He says, "The longer I live, the more I realize the impact of attitude on life. Attitude, to me, is more important than facts. It's more important than the past, than education, than money, than circumstances, than failures, than successes, than what other people think, say, or do. It is more important than appearance, giftedness, or skill. It will make or break a company, a church, a home. The remarkable thing is we have a choice every day regarding the attitude we embrace for that day. We cannot change our past. We cannot change the fact that people will act in a certain way. We cannot change the inevitable. The only thing we can do is play the one string we have, and that's our attitude. I'm convinced that life is 10% what happens to me and 90% how I react to it. And so it is with you. We are in charge of our attitudes. And again, enjoy life, Solomon says. Consider life a gift from God. And when you do that, you will seize the day that the Lord has made. To kind of illustrate that the difference in attitudes, Jim Smith went to church on Sunday morning. He heard the organist miss a note during the prelude and he winced. He saw a teenager talking when everybody was supposed to bow in prayer. He felt like the usher was watching to see what he put in the offering plate, and it made him boil. He caught the preacher making a slip of the tongue 5 times in the sermon by actual count. So as he slipped out through the side door during the closing hymn, he muttered to himself, "Never again. What a bunch of clods and hypocrites." Ron Jones went to church on Sunday morning. He heard the organist play an arrangement of A Mighty Fortress, and he was thrilled by the majesty of it. He heard a young girl take a moment in the service to speak her simple, moving message of the difference her faith makes in her life. He was glad to see that his church was sharing in a special offering for the hungry children of Nigeria. He especially appreciated the sermon that Sunday. It answered a question that had bothered him for a long time. He thought as he walked out the doors of the church, how can a man come here and not feel the presence of God? Both men went to the same church on the same Sunday morning, and each found exactly what he was looking for. Attitude makes all the difference. Verses 14 and 15. I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it, and nothing taken from it. God does it that men should fear before him. That which is has already been. What is to be has already been. And God requires an account of what is past. God's work has a durable quality to it. Nothing may be added, nothing taken away. Proverbs 36 says, do not add to his words, lest he rebuke you and you be found a liar. He says God does what he does that men should fear before him. The fear of God in the wisdom literature refers to piety, respect and awe of God's power, not terror in the sense that we think of fear a lot of times. The proper attitude for us is the fear of the Lord, one commentary says, which is not the cringing of a slave before a cruel master, but the submission of an obedient child to a loving parent. If we fear God, we need not fear anything else, for he's in control. Verse 15 helps us to recall that God's in control of the cycle of life. That which has already been and what is to be has already been. The past seems to repeat itself so that there's no new thing under the sun, as we saw in last week's lesson. But God can break into history and do what he pleases. His many miracles are evidence of that. His own Son broke into human life through a miraculous birth, and then he died on a cross and rose again, thus conquering the life-death cycle. Because Jesus Christ broke the vicious circle, he can make us a part of a new creation that overcomes time and death. 2 Corinthians 5:17 through 21 says, "This means that anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. The old life is gone. A new life has begun." And all of this is a gift from God and has brought us back to himself through Christ. And God has given us the task of reconciling people to him. For God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself, no longer counting people's sins against them, and he gave us this wonderful message of reconciliation. So we are Christ's ambassadors. God is making his appeal through us. We speak for Christ when we plead, "Come back to God." For God made Christ, who never sinned, to be the offering for our sin, so that we could be made right with God through Christ. The last part of verse 15, Solomon added a new thought: God will call the past to account. Scholars have different interpretations of that, because it literally says, God seeks what hurries along. So he seems to say here that time goes by swiftly and gets away from us, but God keeps track of it and will at the end of time call into account what we have done with time. And that ties in with our whole theme in this chapter. Time, life, is a gift from God, and it is important what we do with it, and we will be held accountable for it. There's a lot of good stuff in those 15 verses there. Come back next week, and we'll move on into chapter 4 and the first part of chapter 5. We'll see you then.